But Acts 15 records for us really the council in Jerusalem facing a tremendous crisis, and one that had to be resolved. And the question was, what is the doctrine of salvation really all about? Some were teaching that you could be saved by grace, others that it was indeed the grace of God, but you also had to do some works. And when the gospel went out several years earlier through the ministry of Peter, and he ended up at the house of Cornelius, you remember, that Gentile whose house was filled with Gentiles. And we spent a long time going over that whole deal because God wanted to be sure everyone knew this was his idea. He'd set it up, he orchestrated it, he brought everyone together, he poured out his Spirit upon this house filled with Gentiles. About the same time, 300 miles to the north, some men who had been in town and were chased off when Stephen was killed. They were from Cyrene and from the island of Cyprus. They ended up in Syria, in Antioch, and they began to share with the Hellenists there. Now, the Hellenists, if you haven't been with us, were Jews that grew up in Greek cultures. So that they were Jewish in their practice, but their practices were influenced by the Greek culture in which they lived. So, to the extent of how far away from Jerusalem they were, the Hellenists became more and more Greek almost, or Gentile as they went. So 300 miles away, they found these folks who had some Jewish believing practices, believed in the one God rather than many, and they began to share the gospel with them and with others, and God began to save those men and women in that town about the same time that Peter was preaching. Well, then there was this first missionary journey that Paul took, and he and Barnabas had gone to predominantly Gentile areas, and the writing was on the wall, man. People were getting saved. It's just that some of the hardline Jewish converts hadn't gotten the memo. And so a confrontation began. And I guess it's understandable from the standpoint that when you get saved, if you get saved out of a religious background, for a while, those things are hard to let go of, especially if you've had them for years. My dad was a really practicing Catholic. I mean, really practicing, like he was an ultra-Catholic. For 50 years of his life before he got saved. And then when he started to come to church here, he'd say this stuff. I'd say, Dad, did you like to study this morning? He'd say, man, I have a hard time letting go of some of this stuff because I have great hope in it. He goes, but I know I'm not supposed to hang on to it. And it took him several years to just get over some of the religious things that had gripped his heart. Well, the same thing is true here in the early church. You know, the Jews had been taught for generations, rightfully so, that they were the chosen people of God. What they hadn't learned was that God, through them, wanted to reach the world by sending his Son to them, by blessing them, by allowing them to live ways that they would draw in others and want to be like the God that they served. And so when God began to save the Gentiles, the problem for those predominantly Jewish believers was they saw God moving in a way that bypassed the Jew. In other words, they didn't see the capacity or the work of God being to save Gentiles without them first becoming Jews. And so there were these Judaizers who really believed if you were a Gentile, you convert to Judaism, then you come to Christ, and that's kind of the order that you follow. And it was unacceptable to many Jewish minds that saw Christianity as a Jewish sect, that people could get saved without first becoming Jews. The problem was that was contradicted by every experience with the Gentiles that they'd had. Peter at Cornelius' house, those men who had gone to Antioch in Syria, Barnabas and Paul from the road, and so the conflict escalated. This wasn't about reaching the lost anymore. This was about fighting from within. How do people get saved? And these Judaizers who viewed Paul and some of the others as radicals were calling for the wholesale Gentile evangelism thing to stop. Make them Jews first. And they had even traveled some 300 miles to where Paul was pastoring in Antioch in Syria. They had gone hundreds of miles further into Galatia where Paul had gone on his first missionary journey. And they were debating and dividing and causing a tremendous stir in the church to the point where Paul finally said there in chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, look, we're going to go to Jerusalem, we're going to settle this thing with the mother church, if you will, where the thing began once and for all.